Okay. Okay, so we are finally recording at the beginning of the discussion. The topic I'd like to start us off with concerns I recently decided to see what the industry was up to in terms of interactive storytelling. So I went over to YouTube and I looked at a number of their lectures regarding storytelling, narrative, and so forth. And I watched a few of them. The more I watched, the more I had to exercise discipline in putting up with this crap. My experience was these people don't know what they're doing. In particular, the lectures I saw, it was clear that none, I looked at two fully and two more partly. And it was obvious to me, these people don't know what a story is. There was a computer science person who was applying all sorts of powerful computer science tools to a very ignorant concept of what a story is. And there was another fellow, a sort of a big shot, who was talking in grandiose terms about their wonderful product and all the narrative stuff in it. And he never really talked about narrative. So I came away, and then the other people were similar in tone. They like to use the word narrative, but they don't seem to care very much about storytelling. Now, the first question I would like to ask people is, can other people provide some of their own experience on this to either support or weaken my own impression, which is clearly based on a small sample? Anybody have any experience that goes either way on this question?
I have some.
Sure.
Right now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on this FIFA project, and I realized, okay, we are right now working on a proof of concept, and I get it that it has to be simple and understandable by people who are not from the industry. I totally get it. However, as we designers, we have to, in my idea, we have to design it in a way that people will get something out of it, I hope. And for that, we have to be giving some kind of information. And most of the time, this information comes in terms of a journey, a user journey, and which brings some kind of story, at least some kind of like real short story, something. And I feel like at work, that is not really being cared about. Right now, it's all about how we're gonna explain what you can touch, what you cannot touch, what can happen, and etc. But there's no like, okay, this is what the user will get out of it because we're gonna be saying this, that, and this by making them do this, that, and that. So yeah, that's my experience. I feel like it's in the industry, we are not a game company, I have to say, like, but in the industry, I don't think people really understand how important is storytelling and how much actually of the story that any kind of things that can be a story, like you grabbing a coffee can be a story. If it's a good one, you're like, that coffee was good, and you remember it and it stays with you. But for some reason, when it comes to work as important as this, it's in the air. I don't get it.
Well, I can add a small bit to that in the form of the fact, my belief that story is one of the most fundamental mental structure, data structures in the human mind. That is, if you think about it, a sentence is a story. very short story, but it rained. That's a story, tiny, tiny, tiny. But I believe that language and storytelling evolved together. And so if you want to communicate to people, you're going to end up using something similar to a story. It may not be a story as we think of modern stories, which are very sophisticated and complicated and so forth, but information transmission among humans is really primarily based on storytelling. Indeed, one of the common techniques used in communicating difficult information where the audience might not be willing to hear the message. A good way to do that is to tell a story, because it's hard to argue with a story. But does anybody else have any experiences or seen any of the YouTube videos or attended any lectures where they were demonstrating either solid understanding or gross misunderstanding of the nature of storytelling?
I think a lot of these people just don't understand people. I think that's like a fundamental problem too. They're really good at the coding. They're really good at the mechanics and the algorithms, but they, like in engineering, I see that a lot too. I mean, it's like people don't know why people are buying Keurigs. There's nothing revolutionary about the technology. I mean, the experience of using this little coffee machine is very nice. That's it. And there's no way to quantify that niceness. And it's just over and over and over again. And I mean, the very few games, tell a story, like a handful of them.
That is a good point. It does seem there seems to be a strong selection effect in programming against social skills. But the enormous expansion of programming, that is, we're getting more and more people pouring into the field. There are millions of people working on software nowadays. You would think that we would in fact get a broader range of more socially oriented people. And so, why haven't these people been able to express themselves? I'm digressing here, but do you think there's a factor of there's always been something I call the technical aristocracy in the programming fields? Whoever knows the most dominates. And so the expert who knows every little inside detail of the programming language tends to run the show, really. This was certainly the case 40 years ago and throughout most of my career. Is this still pretty much, I mean, are you guys experiencing this nowadays?
I think there's less of that because of the indie design movement. There's a lot of there are a lot of systems that people can use to build games much more easily now. There are things like Twine that are extremely easy to use, compared to 30 years ago. And because of that, we've seen a lot of people making small, simple, independent games that incorporate a lot of weird stuff. There was kind of a renaissance with the Twine tool a while back that I think Porpentine kicked off with her game Howling Dogs. A lot of like subcultures, like the LGBT community uses Twine to make a lot of games kind of geared towards LGBT stuff. because it's an easy tool to use. It makes game design more accessible, which I really like.
Mm.
Another thing I wanted to bring up, which might be relevant to what you said, I just read through a fascinating book called Free to Learn. Have you heard of that book?
No.
No? I would really be interested in hearing your thoughts on it if you have a chance to read it. But it's about learning. It's about how kids can learn through directing their own learning better. But it has a short section on creativity, which really made me think and made me question some of my ideas about creativity that I've held on to. And basically he goes through some experiments that have been done, and he talks about how evaluation and pressure to be creative hinders our ability to be creative. Like there's an experiment that was done where they divided kids up into different groups, and there was one group that they were going to, like, they told the kids your thing you're creating will be entered into a contest and judged, and then other kids they just let them create a thing for fun. And the kids that were just creating for fun were, according to the judges in this experiment, were able to be more creative. And they have different things along those lines. And that really, I would connect that back to computer programming, but because I think when you learn how to program computers, at least for me, I learned to think in a very systematic, analytical kind of way. And I think that's possibly hindered the creativity of computer programmers and the playful nature of computer programmers, because they set aside the more playful approach to things and the more creative approach to things in order to think in more analytical and evaluative terms, if that makes sense. They think in terms of judging exactly how things need to be by some kind of objective standard. And what they really should do is just kind of play and create for fun. And I think they would come closer to actually being artists if they set aside that judgmental nature in favor of a more playful nature.
Well, that raises the very interesting question: is logical thinking in any way inimical to creative thinking? I'm not sure. I'm torn on that question because I see them as rather as independent cognitive efforts. I don't see it as, there's one side of your mind that does logic and another side that does creativity, and you live in one or the other. I see them as just, yeah, they're different parts of the mind, but I don't see any reason why one obstructs the other. It's an interesting question, and I don't have a strong opinion about it. But the problem of creativity, I will certainly say agree with the point that pressure to create obstructs creativity. In fact, I just exercised this. I've been working very hard on Le Morte Arthur, and I ran into a very difficult creative problem. And I struggled with it all through September and October. And then on November 1st, I decided, okay, fine. I'm just going to stop working on this. I'll go work on technical problems. And for the month of November, I have been just working on some programming issues associated with it, just so as to allow the creative efforts to go on by themselves, subconsciously. And that has worked for me. I have found many times it's very good to, in fact, even at a very small scale effort, I will work on the computer for a few hours, and then I sense that my brain is starting to get a little fuzzy. So I go outside and plant trees or whatever. I found it useful to alternate between different kinds of efforts. So I don't know, but I will definitely look at that book. Any other comments on the creativity issues?
Well, creativity is a risk, right? You don't know if you're going to hit the mark. A technical benchmark, very easy to quantify, very easy to know when you've hit the mark. And creativity and neuropathy, or is it neuropathy? Like being crazy, are very heavily correlated. So I could see people that are very creative being less in a middle manager role in general in these larger institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, and also creativity needs, I mean, to express your creativity, you need some constraints, like pure creativity, like a brainstorming between like 12 people. It produces nothing. Like, but if you have a constraint, it could be 20 people doing a brainstorming and it will produce something. Like the constraint is you have to, I don't know, in a project, like a game project, we want to create, I don't know, a new character. And the character has to be, I don't know, it's a protagonist of the game. And so people will get creative, produce ideas, but towards a goal, creating a character. If you say, let's create a movie, and you create a movie with 12 people, you have to create a script from with no, I mean, total freedom. You'll get most of the time nothing. But there's like I don't know, techniques for creativity. Like if you really want to produce, like if you want to produce like ideas, like a factory, I don't know. Well, you can do like force creativity by doing some techniques, like you do brainstorming, but for 15 minutes, and you say, okay, so all the first ideas are thrown out in the garbage because you all have the same ideas because of the, I don't know, collective unconscious, like, and then we put all the ideas on a board and we select, everybody votes. So like the collective unconscious of the group will select the best ideas. And then you need to assign, I don't know, tasks to people. Like, for example, the coder will code the logic of the game. The artist will make the art of the game, because, and what's important in this is the team. Like it's very hard. Some people can do everything, but me personally, I can't make 3D art. It's really complicated, really long. I'm not good at it. And so it's, for me, creativity is a team effort. It's a team.
Okay,
It's a team. Yeah.
Let's consider the differences between team creativity and individual creativity, because I've always been individual. I've never, I find it very frustrating to engage in team creativity, mostly because someone comes up with an idea and I can immediately see a problem with that idea, but I don't want to criticize it. And so very frustrating experience for me. I'd like to offer a hypothesis here, and I'd like to hear criticism of it. The hypothesis is that team creativity is best for small creative steps, whereas individual creativity is the only way to achieve the grand leaps, the really striking ideas. Comments on that?
Yeah, well, a book usually is written by one person, not a group. I mean, I don't know much books, except the best books like I don't know, what's the best books? I don't know, the Odyssey, Ulysses. It's not one guy who wrote the story. It's like many collective. I don't know. We don't know, but there's plenty of authors in writing Ulysses. I don't know, like religious books like the Bible. It's not one guy who sat down and say, well, today I'm going to write the Bible. You know, it's a book written in 1,000 years with plenty of people, rewrote everything.
Call
But
the Bible, though, great storytelling. It's an anthology, I think is the best way to describe
yeah,
it. But it's true that folk tales that have undergone long development, such as the Homeric, Iliad and Odyssey, the Arthurian legends, these have certainly been improved enormously. On the other hand, I'll point out that the real power of these, the best one, or the one legend series that we know the most about is the Arthurian legends, because there have been so many different variations on these. We have the classic Arthurian legend with the love triangle between Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, but that actually turns out is rather modern. That showed up about 600 years ago. Before that, there wasn't even a Lancelot. He was brought in by the French troubadours. Then now in the 1970s, we had a book called The Myths of Avalon, which is a feminist Arthurian legend. We had Mark Twain in the 19th century producing a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is a social satire of the 19th century American society. Those legends have been used for all sorts of different things. Is that group creativity, or, there is no such thing as the core Arthurian legend. It's a bunch of different things.
yeah, but it's like written by, it's not like one guy who writes it, or a woman who wakes up and says, I'm gonna write this legend.
Each of these copies, though, Lorenzo, has one guy writing it, right? They're taking this scaffold and they're putting their vision on the scaffold. But if you're making, like, if you're a huge company, you don't want one guy, right? You get the Metal Gear Solid scenario where you have the auteur, and it's like the brand is no longer Metal Gear Solid. Now it's the creator. That's an institutional risk. You almost don't want that.
Naz wanted to say something here.
I'm not going to comment on the stories. I want to tell you about my process with my team writing a proposal for a VR experience idea, which we applied some funds for, but didn't win as students we are. So I watched this film made by another fellow student like me, like 5 years ago, and that film was very effective on me. And I remember leaving the theater feeling like, wow, that was art. And then fast forward 5 years later, I came to CGL for studying game design. And by that time, I was in love with virtual reality. All I wanted to do was virtual reality. And then I found about this fund that I hoped we could apply for. And thankfully, our school supported us. So I formed a team with people from another school called International Film School, but they are studying digital narratives. So they are learning about what I believe, I'm not studying in them, what I believe, how, I hope it's interactive storytelling with different mediums. So I teamed up with them and I showed them this short film. And I told them, like, I see this working as an interactive working well, can be translated well into a virtual reality with interactive storytelling. We can help people feel the same way. But I gave the writing job to the digital narratives, and they started to bring these ideas that was a bit different than mine at first. I like to control my ideas. Who doesn't as a designer? I brought up the first inspiration and the things that can apply to virtual reality, right? So this is what I brought to the table, and they started taking parts of it, and I was like, okay, I gave the job to them. Let me just stand it. So they started adding different parts that started really working well after a while in my brain, such as in this film that I saw, and they saw as well. They were what can I explain? People like us, but they are made of wires. So they took this wire idea totally out and they put batteries inside. So in order for people to move on in that reality, you have to keep being charged, or you have to find batteries. So I was like, well, how are you gonna explain people to be connected? How are you gonna make sure that they understand they are connected with one another? But it started to work well. So that's what I wanted to say. It was my process of accepting the deception of my ideas, of what I believe was the core idea, and still do. And then when they brought up this new mechanics, I was like, first fighting with the idea, but then it really worked out in my brain. So we wrote the application form with our vision to explain how the dynamics of so this VR experience was supposed to be a metaphor of how destructive the dynamics of hyper-capitalism that we are stepping towards every day. And in my idea, with their contributions, it became a better idea. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. Other comments on team versus individual creativity?
Well, I think that often you find that great things happen in contributions for in teams of say 2 or 3 people. So for example, you'd have a writer, and then for example his friend would make illustrations for the book. So if you have just a very small team of people and each has like a distinct task that they are great at, and they understand each other and they understand the mission, then that's probably the way that great things are done, when there is no group making decisions, but the group can work towards the product.
Well, certainly we have examples in the existence of a variety of different art forms. For example, cinema cannot be done by an individual. Cinema always requires a team of artists, each with their own specialty, and they work together as a team. And in fact, after more than 120 years of experimentation, they have developed a social system for organizing how the creativity of each individual, how these individuals all plug in together into a team, so that it is clear that this guy, he decides this, that lady there, she decides this type of problem, and so forth. And yet everybody has a right to sort of make a suggestion. Actors in particular are noted for frequently changing the script or coming up with completely new ideas, many of which are brilliant. So we have that with cinema. On the other hand, we have novels, which are almost always the product of a single mind. So those are two extremes. And then there are musical groups, usually a smaller group of maybe 4 people putting together a musical idea. But then there's painting and sculpture. There's so many different art forms, but clearly some require an individual and some require a team. And I have never figured out why you need, what it is about a particular medium that requires a certain number of creative agents. I will point out one important point. Most of the ideas for movies originate in novels. I think that tells us something important. It may about the difference between what I call grand creativity and small creativity. Again, we seem to have the conclusion that grand creativity is the work of an individual, but small creativity is done by teams. Thoughts?
I don't know.
I think art is hard.
Yes, definitely.
I would say that I don't think any type of creativity can be done by an individual. Even your example with books, it's almost never like just one person. Okay, so there is the artist, but even that artist has some friends, and sometimes those friends are also like writers. Sometimes they even have like writers group where they just share ideas or just bounce ideas of each other and give critical feedback, which sometimes is like essential to make like a great novel or any sort of like meaningful book.
I agree that novelists often like to obtain feedback on their work, but there are plenty of cases of artists, of novelists, not getting any feedback at all. I mean, nowadays, certainly we've developed better systems for providing novelists with feedback, but certainly if we look back into historical times, there was clearly lots of writing going on without any feedback at all. And some truly great works were developed that way. So,
Okay, but how many? Like, I mean, in terms of quantity, did that produce like more great work, or were they like 1 in a million, and because we now have that support structure, let's say an editor that helps make the work better for someone who has like a great idea but struggles to convey it, so perhaps now we can like make it easier to create great things, to multiply the effects of that
certainly
initial spark of genius.
I think that Shakespeare was the greatest writer in the English language, and we know that he pretty much worked alone. And that's an extreme case, and we can write all Shakespeare and say, well, yeah, but he was a genius, he doesn't count. But then again, we can look at some of the other historical writers. Mark Twain, the 19th century writers, they tended to be, they didn't have good communications networks. And so they pretty much had to work alone. the extreme case would be Montaigne, who was not a novelist, but the classic image of he worked in this garret atop a house and this little tiny space where he wrote all of his essays. So prior to the period of easy communication, novelists worked pretty much alone. And so clearly the fact that these collaborative efforts, the multiple feedback processes have taken over demonstrates clearly that they are superior in final result. But
I'm not sure. Maybe you're citing one creative leader who's in charge of the whole process. Like I'm thinking in movies like I don't know, great directors.
The Shining.
Stanley Kubrick. I had this conversation with a friend. I told him Stanley Kubrick, The Shining, a guy having total control and everything, and he says to me, "No, Kubrick is a perfect example. He has great teams, great director of photography, great actors, great like Kubrick without Shining without the actors is you know, and if you push it forward like Shining without the studio producing it, without all the money to able to to make the thing." So, but what I wanted to say before we talked about Shining is like maybe novels made by 19th century was telling something about the context of the writing. Like the society was more like hierarchical. Like you had like one king, one state, one church, something like that. And now we are more in we are still in a hierarchy, blah blah blah, but we are more like horizontal. Like in companies, in smaller companies, you have no real boss, no real no clear authority, and it's like everything's cool, blah blah blah, and like creative process are more made in teams now. Like a singer will work with a director to make his image, because you can't only make a song if you have no visual feature. You don't exist in the visual space because you need an image, and yeah, most of the things are made by teams. And maybe you could say that production of today is lesser than production of before, but that's like the old tune of it was better before. Like but I'm asking, where is the guy who's making The Shining today? Where are the directors of the old days that were golden? I don't know.
Well, I think I'm going to I agree that for many creative efforts, clearly teams are better, and you can refine a creative product and get a better result with a team. On the other hand, I think I'm going to be more firm about the notion that the grand creative achievements are done by individuals. I mean, we didn't have Beethoven working with some other people so that they add their ideas, as in dum 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 dum, let's throw that in too. That or Michelangelo working on the Sistine Chapel, lying there for days on end in the scaffolding, looking, working on the thing by himself. He did. All these Renaissance artists did have assistants who filled in stuff for them, but the basics, the design, the architecture of the painting was always done by the primary artist. So maybe I think the best conclusion we can draw is that these fabulous leaps are done by individuals, but what we might call the much more common creativity requires the use of teams, putting together lots of ideas. So
And also depends of the kind of art. Like I got a friend who's making music. He can make everything by himself. He can, you know, he has a computer. He has some music artistry talent, but he will use some voices made by someone else.
Yeah.
It's decentralization of I don't know. It's like you can buy someone singing a tune on the internet for like, I don't know, 10 euros, $10, and then you take it, you break it apart, and you do something else. So you could work alone, but it's not really alone. And yeah, I lost my my train of thought. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I'd like to bring us back to the original concept here of the how well the computer entertainment industry grasps the concept of storytelling. We clearly, this little group, you know, we all as a group appreciate the importance of storytelling and accord it the respect it deserves, but are we getting the material that we are? Is the industry up to the task, or is it a hopeless situation? Mathieu, you have
yes, I've been watching a lot of YouTube discussions of particular things that are happening in video games, which is obviously not exactly what we're discussing here, but it's the closest alternative from the industry. And I find that overall the discussion is much better when it surrounds like not stories but places, because I think there's this big awkwardness around stories in that people want to avoid spoilers, because stories are something that you like experience and you see the twists and turns, and it's like it's something that you cannot quite convey in shorthand in a video. But you can have lots of discussions about environments, because there it's about immersion. And even if you hear about a world, like for example, there was this game called Subnautica. It's played on an ocean planet, and it's not really about a story, but it's about a kind of design idea of the place. And it's also it tells a story in a way of the oceans of our world as well. And you can discuss this on the internet with people, because you do not really risk ruining that for them, because the real experience is in then going towards there and existing within the world. But if you want to discuss a story that's really moved you, you're probably going to make the actual experience of going through that story worse for the people. And that I think makes this discussion really awkward. And I don't know, just some thoughts.
Well, that is certainly the case with stories, but it is not the case with storytelling. Stories have plots. Storytelling doesn't. Stories are data structures. Storytelling is a process. And so, and it's funny, you know, I solved that problem. I explained how to get around that 30 years ago, and I've given lectures and I've published articles. I put stuff in my books in it, and people are still stuck on that problem. It is, I don't know, it's very frustrating to me to see that problem continuing to cause difficulty. But that then takes me to a different aspect of this. Well, do we think that the industry is hopeless? I mean, are they ever going to get storytelling?
Sure.
I mean, a wrinkle in this, I heard recently, the storyteller doesn't tell the story, the listener does. So, I mean, clearly they're making platforms that are immersive, that have the environmental storytelling, that if you were playing with like another person, you could do like a role play, you could tell your own story, but that story isn't really being given, you know, it's not being like laid out, like the grand themes or like something that's compelling where you have like a character actually change or that you actually care about. I see that very rarely, but they do come out. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Is spatial reasoning still obstructing progress on story? That is, I have long ranted and raved about how spatial reasoning dominates all thinking about design. Are we seeing that? In fact, one of my complaints is expressed in the simple dictum: every game has a map somewhere. It may be hidden, but it's in there somewhere. Do you think that rule is being broken? Are we seeing more games without any maps?
Yes, I do think we are. Visual novels and some interactive fiction, some of the more recent choose your own adventure style interactive fiction lacks maps. So there's a visual novel I really enjoyed called But You Seem Fine, which is about a young teenage girl that has an illness, and she goes through, and a whole bunch of doctors can't figure out what her illness is, and the whole game is about whether she persists in trying to find what's wrong with her or whether she gives up. And there's, to my recollection, there's no map in the game at all. It's entirely focused on one particular character and her relation to her mother and her best friend, and to a lesser extent, the various doctors that she sees.
Is this interactive, substantially interactive?
I only played through it once. I think the story was mostly linear. The basic fundamental choice the player makes is, do you persist or do you give up? And of course, if you persist, you make that choice, you make variations of that choice repeatedly over the course of the game. And you have to persist all the way to the end in order to, get a decent ending. And there's small details that change based on your choices regarding how you interact with your best friends, and whether there's some conflict with the best friend character and different things. So I only played through it once, so I wasn't sure exactly how interactive it was in terms of how much the ending would change, but it's a good example of a game that focuses on characters rather than on spatial reasoning.
Okay. Nas, you raise your hand.
I want to go back to the question a little bit. The way I understand it, the question was, it is computational entertainment systems can computational entertainment systems / industry exist or be done or be delivered without a map? Was that the question? Or did I understand something completely else? I wasn't sure.
The question I was asking concerned the whether storytelling has become whether the industry is starting to get storytelling understanding it as a story that is, it's about people, not things, and not maps. Is the industry showing any progress here?
Okay, then I understood something else.
Oh, well, if you have a comment to make on that, something else.
No, I think I want to like take a step back and think about it for a
Okay.
while.
Okay.
I think maps are used by a lot of games because it's relatively easy to make a map interactive. You come up with a map and the player can explore that world. And I consider it more of a stepping stone on the way to interactive storytelling, because interacting with a character, it's harder to get that right.
Yeah.
Whereas interacting with a map is it's relatively easy to make an engaging experience.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's in a basic form, it's a whole lot easier to interact with a character by blowing their fucking head off than by engaging them in conversation. So there's no question, interactive storytelling is an immensely more difficult problem than game design. But the question is whether in my mind, is whether the industry is really starting to take this problem seriously or is continuing to simply dance around it. There are a bunch of lectures on YouTube from GDC. If you search YouTube for GDC narrative, you'll get a bunch of things to watch, none of which really talk about interactive storytelling. So, well, none that I saw. It would be interesting to actually go through all of them to get a strict assessment, but this would take a long time and you'd have to put up with a lot of garbage.
On the environment story question, like when we look at sculpture, does like a sculpture tell a story easier than like a installation? Like where it's like you go in a room and the room changes colors. Does that tell less of a story than like a sculpture?
Well, it's much
Neither
more
really is a
abstract.
storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, some sculpture and certainly some paintings tell a story. A very good example would be the Michelangelo's Pietà in the Vatican, showing Mary holding the body of Jesus. Boy, there's a story in that. But that's classical sculpture. Modern sculpture expresses ideas at a far more abstract level. But in terms of classical sculpture, Statue of David, as you walk around, at first he's looking very noble, but as you walk around, you realize he's also looking really scared. The Dying Celt tells a story about death. So yes, you can do that with sculpture. Also, classical painting, a great deal of that can tell. There's some really powerful stories built into some of the greatest paintings of all. The Last Supper, all those faces and the way they're looking at each other and so forth. Complicated story there. And then, Mona Lisa, looking at that face and wondering, what is she thinking? There's an awful lot buried in that. So yeah, you can do it, but it is still very abstract. Whereas we're talking about something a lot simpler, just plain old everyday storytelling. So, and yet we can't do that. So
would you say, Chris, that that we need to create kind of bad stories before we can create good stories?
oh yeah I mean, I once, one way I quantified this was to talk about the number of verbs being used in a given story. And I had my own experience with the SWAT technology was that once you got up to about 100 verbs, it started getting really difficult. And then I dug out, I bought a copy of My Little Golden Book of The Little Mermaid, which takes the Little Mermaid movie and boils it down to, something that a 5-year-old can read, and, like 20 or 30 pages long. I counted the number of unique verbs in it. There were 125 unique verbs in this book. So here I am struggling with 100 verbs on the story SWAT, and the simplest possible story has 125 unique verbs. So that's one way of quantifying the difficulty of our problem.
Agreed. I wanted to mention, Chris, have you heard of the Narrowscope?
No, I haven't. What is that?
It's similar to GDC. They have a bunch of lectures online with not very many views, but they're a bit more focused on interactive fiction and storytelling focused games. And I think you'd still, they're not entirely going off of your ideas, but you would probably find more to like in watching some of the lectures there than you would in watching GDC lectures. It sounded like you were finding the GDC lectures really frustrating.
Yeah. Okay. I will look into that.
Okay.
But we are out of time, so I'm going to close this, and I really should terminate this meeting so that we terminate the video. Or wait, I can just stop recording, can't? Well, yeah, I'll just stop recording and then I'll leave the meeting. No, you guys can do it on Slack. That will probably be a better way to continue. So until next month, next year. By the way, I am hoping to spend several meetings discussing Le Mort d'Arthur, but I'm waiting until I have something you can actually look at. We're not there yet. So anyway, I will see you guys next year.
Have a great one.
Okay.
Have
See
a
you.
good one, Chris.
Bye.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Bye.